Jean Shrimpton did not set out to change fashion, to scandalize entire continents, or to become the first model whose name alone could sell a magazine. She arrived instead as something more dangerous, an achingly beautiful young woman who seemed not to care whether she was being watched. In an era utterly obsessed with surfaces, that indifference became revolutionary. Cameras adored her because she did not flatter them. Men projected fantasies onto her because she refused to play hostess to them. And when the noise became unbearable, she simply walked away, leaving the world to argue over what it had lost and wonder whatever happened to Jean. Welcome to Society Mysteries. Jean Rosemary Shrimpton was born on the 7th of November, 1942, in High Wycombe, Buckinghamshire, into a household that could hardly have been further removed from fashion's electric glare. Her father, Bertie Shrimpton, was a self-made building contractor who bought a 60-acre farm to indulge a lifelong devotion to animals. He was emotionally distant but principled, a man of routines and certain expectations. Her mother upheld a conservative moral order that very much valued restraint over display. Jean and her younger sister Chrissy grew up among fields, dogs, horses, and the daily choreography of rural life. Glamour did not exist there, neither did ambition, at least not in any recognizable sense. Jean was a reserved child, more at ease with animals than people, a tomboy who preferred solitude to social games. At school, St. Bernard's Convent in Slough, she passed quietly through the system, neither rebellious nor engaged, doing just enough to get by. She later recalled feeling fundamentally misplaced, as if she were observing life rather than participating in it. Nonetheless, by her teens, her spectacular looks ensured that she too was being observed everywhere she went. This detachment would later become her great professional strength, though at the time it merely marked her as an outsider. At 17, with no clear direction, she enrolled at Langham Secretarial College in London. The choice was practical, almost apologetic. She entered a world of shorthand, typing, and an office future. London itself, however, was beginning to hum with something new: music, youth, possibility. But Jean moved through it without curiosity, although this is not to say she was passionless. At 18, she seduced a younger local boy from home, which had caused a minor scandal. But for Jean, it might have been an early sighter to see just how much sexual charisma and power she had. The answer was a lot. Then, on a street one day, she was stopped by film director Cy Enfield, who thought she might suit a role in Mysterious Island. The audition failed. Jean was disappointed. But Enfield, spotting something untrained but unusual, suggested she try modelling instead and pointed her toward the Lucy Clayton Charm Academy. It was not a dream fulfilled from childhood exactly. It was more of an accident compounded by another accident, and it did not go down well at home. My father told me he wouldn't speak to me again for a year. He had a strong moral code and I was a selfish little hussy, she said. He just thought, what is my bloody daughter doing? But you're self-centered when you're young, so I didn't worry much. Ignoring her fraught parents, she enrolled in late 1960, learned how to stand, how to move, how to speak when required, and most crucially, how to endure being looked at, gazed at, observed. Even then she was awkward. Photographers found her gawky, coltish, incapable of holding a pose. One told her bluntly that she could not stand still long enough to be photographed. Others, a bit more perceptive, saw something rarer. Limbs that seemed to go on forever. A face that did not make a spectacle of femininity, but suggested it in an oblique way, as if distracted by something more interesting just out of frame. Her first break came not through talent so much as timing. Sent to British Vogue as a substitute when another model failed to appear, she was photographed rather unsexily for a knitting catalogue. That led to another booking, then another. She was not yet skilled, but she was a diligent model, willing to work hard. And she was also unusually unguarded. Around this time, a hip young photographer named David Bailey noticed her on a Kellogg's cornflakes shoot. He was struck not only by her looks, but by her apparent indifference to them. He arranged a test shoot. The chemistry was immediate, visceral, and transformative for them both. By 1962, Bailey had secured a contract with Vogue and insisted that Jean accompany him to New York for an editorial experiment that would later be titled Young Idea Goes West. The shoot broke almost every rule the magazine had quietly enforced for decades. Jean was photographed running through Manhattan streets, leaning against brick walls, laughing, distracted, and alive. There was no polish, no aristocratic hauteur, no sense of modeling as aspiration. When the images appeared in the April issue, they detonated. Fashion photography would never fully recover from their freshness. At 18, Jean Shrimpton became visible in a way that few women, models or otherwise, ever had. By 20, she was unavoidable. Covers followed in dizzying succession: Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, Vanity Fair, Time, Newsweek. In 1963, Glamour named her Model of the Year. She was soon being described, with a mixture of awe and unease, as the highest paid model in the world. The press uncreatively christened her the Shrimp, a nickname she despised but could not shake. In any case, she did not cultivate celebrity. It attached itself to her regardless. What made her different was not simply her face, though its combination of heavy fringe, wide-set eyes and unforced sensuality became the template for a decade, but the way she inhabited it. She did not seduce the camera, she just about tolerated it. She did not perform emotion, she allowed it to happen, or not. Photographers found this intoxicating. Actors noticed it too. During a shoot with Steve McQueen, he observed her ability to, quote, turn it on and off. Jean replied without drama that this was simply the job, an automatic reflex. Why model when the camera shutter isn't clicking? Her private life, meanwhile, was becoming inseparable from her public image. Her relationship with Bailey began while he was still married, and when his divorce became public, Jean was named in the proceedings. In early 1960s Britain, this was not a minor indiscretion. Her father was furious, cutting off contact for a year and refusing to speak to Bailey, appalled by what he saw as a moral collapse. He did soften on Bailey eventually, though, as Jean explained, he liked shrewd East End boys, so when he finally met him, they got on very well. Jean, barely out of adolescence, bore the scrutiny with a kind of numb resolve. She later admitted she had been selfish, absorbed in the immediacy of passion and work, blind to its collateral damage. Bailey and Shrimpton became the visual shorthand for swinging London, working-class ambition colliding with pastoral innocence, sex and intellect braided together in black and white frames. Jean would later say she owed him everything, not only professionally, but intellectually. He insisted she think, read, engage. He sharpened her. But the relationship was combustible, fueled by infidelity, ego, and the relentless pace of fame. By 1964, it was over. She moved almost immediately into another intensely public affair, this time with actor Terence Stamp. Together they were unbearably beautiful, photographed endlessly, praised as the most glamorous couple in Britain. Privately, the dynamic was colder. Stamp was distant, self-involved and withholding. Jean later described feeling like a supporting character in a film about him. After 3 years, she walked away without ceremony. Stamp was devastated. He would later write of her as the great loss of his life. Jean's response, years later, was characteristically unsentimental. If he loved her, she said, he had a strange way of showing it. He was incredibly beautiful, and I was in love with his looks, she said. I was infatuated and in awe of him, but I wasn't in love with him. In 1965, while still at the height of her fame, Jean travelled to Australia for a promotional tour centred around the Melbourne Cup. On Derby Day, she arrived wearing a simple white shift dress and worn without hat, gloves or stockings. The reaction was immediate and utterly ferocious. Newspapers exploded, commentators declared it indecent. Social rules were invoked, then broken, then abandoned. Jean had not intended a provocation. In London, such a dress was already unremarkable. In Australia, it became a rupture. 5 inches of exposed knee accelerated a cultural shift that was already underway elsewhere. By the mid-1960s, Jean Shrimpton had become something unprecedented, a model whose presence altered social behaviour. Designers did not need to persuade women to wear miniskirts. They simply photographed Jean in them. Editors did not need manifestos. They needed her face. Yet the very qualities that made her indispensable, the detachment, the lack of vanity, the refusal to perform gratitude, also made her restive. She distrusted the industry's adulation and sensed early its darker undertow. She experimented briefly with acting, appearing in Privilege in 1967 and later in a television film. The work left her cold. She did not crave reinvention so much as escape. In New York, she dated older men, discovered museums, books, and ideas that existed outside fashion's echo chamber. Back in England, relationships with poets and writers followed. Each step took her further from the machinery that had made her famous. By 30, she made a decision that absolutely stunned the industry. She stopped, not gradually, not apologetically, but decisively. She no longer wanted to be a model. It wasn't so much a retirement as an abdication. However, Jean Shrimpton's disappearance from fashion was not emotionally dramatic in the way the press of the time would have you believe. There were no breakdowns, no tabloid implosions, no public denunciations of former lovers or employers. She simply stopped answering the call. To an industry that thrived on access, this quiet refusal felt almost insulting. To Jean, it felt necessary. By the early 1970s, the modelling world she had helped create was no longer recognisable as the improvisational playground of the early 60s. The money had increased, but so had the cynicism. Models were being processed faster, younger, more aggressively. The work demanded not just beauty, but constant emotional availability to cameras, to editors, to audiences who felt entitled to intimacy. Jean, who had never actually enjoyed being photographed despite excelling at it, found the atmosphere increasingly poisonous. She would later describe fashion as populated by, quote, dark, troubled people, an environment that burned through talent and left wreckage behind. She watched colleagues unravel. She recognized the signs in herself. So she left. At first, the withdrawal seemed temporary. She reduced bookings, turned down lucrative offers, ignored invitations. Then she moved out of London altogether, settling in Cornwall, far from studios and social pages. In 1975, she opened a small antiques shop in the village of Marazion. The gesture was almost aggressively ordinary. Where once her face had been a global commodity, now she priced sideboards and handled receipts. Locals knew her as Jean, not the Shrimp. That anonymity was not a loss. It was a relief. She took photographs herself during this period, quiet observational black and white portraits of people she met in Cornwall. They were never shown publicly. Photography, stripped of commerce and expectation, became private again, became document and craft. It is telling that she did not reverse roles and seek recognition as an artist. The act itself was enough. Around this time, she met Michael Cox, a former photographer whose temperament mirrored her own retreat from spectacle. Cox was gentle, self-effacing, uninterested in status. Where Jean's earlier relationships had been conducted under Klieg lights, this one unfolded in near invisibility. They married in January 1979 at a registry office in Penzance, a deliberately modest affair, followed by fish and chips and champagne. Jean was 4 months pregnant. Later that year, she gave birth to their son. Motherhood altered the geometry of her life more completely than fame ever had. The intensity she had once directed toward work was redirected inward, then outward again, toward a child whose existence was blissfully untouched by her former notoriety. There was no performance here, nothing to sell. It was simply life, happening at a humane scale. That same year, Jean and Michael purchased a 17th century building in Penzance called the Abbey Hotel and began the long, grueling process of renovation. The work was physical, financial, often exhausting. It demanded skills that had nothing to do with bone structure or presence. They ran the hotel themselves for decades, living above it, cleaning rooms, cooking breakfasts, managing staff. Guests occasionally recognized her, most did not. Either way, the beds needed changing. If there is a temptation to romanticize this phase as pastoral redemption, it should be resisted. Jean has never pretended the transition was easy. Money was tight, the work was relentless. There were moments of doubt, periods of exhaustion, a long and difficult menopause that she later described with unsparing honesty. Yet the difference was agency. For the first time, her labour belonged to her. The public, however, refused to let her go. Her absence became a story in itself. Fashion journalists described her as reclusive, mysterious, and damaged. The reality that she simply did not care to be famous was apparently too banal to accept. In 1990, she agreed, reluctantly, to publish an autobiography. The motive was practical rather than confessional. The hotel roof needed repairing. The book was frank, unsentimental, and occasionally severe. She wrote of her lovers without nostalgia, of fashion without reverence, of herself without self-pity. Some readers were startled by the lack of myth-making, others were relieved. Jean did not tour the book. She did not parlay it into a comeback. When the check cleared, she returned to work and under a much-needed new roof. Occasionally, she resurfaced. In 2010, she appeared briefly on a British television programme about struggling country houses, offering viewers a glimpse of her life at the Abbey Hotel. In 2012, a BBC drama depicted her early relationship with Bailey. When asked what she thought of being portrayed on screen, she was unmoved. She did not live her life through the prism of the past, she said. That was someone else. What is striking, revisiting Jean Shrimpton's later years, is not bitterness but clarity. She does not deny what she was or what she represented. She simply refuses to be governed by it. Fame, she has said, is difficult to cope with when you have no respect for it or what it brings. For many, such a statement could read as posturing. In her case, it is borne out by a lifetime of behaviour. And it sounds to me like one of the wisest things I've ever heard a famous person say. By the time fashion began its cyclical rediscovery of the 1960s, through exhibitions, coffee table books, and museum retrospectives, Jean was already decades removed. Her images reappeared everywhere, in galleries, in magazines, on mood boards. Designers cited her, models were compared to her. She did not attend the openings. The photographs existed independently of her consent now, as they always had. In fact, she had a sharp word or two for Bailey, who for the last few years has been a near neighbour of Jean's, about his endless hustle on the back of her perfect jaw structure. I tell him he's done all right out of me, and he just laughs. He doesn't give a damn, she said. He's done all those bloody books, full of pictures of me, and he never even sends me a copy. He keeps bringing out more and more, and I said, "You could have sent my mum one, Bailey." He said, "I didn't think you cared." I said, "Well, I don't really, but it's a courtesy." And it's true, Bailey has done more than all right out of Jean over the years, but he's not the only one. The entire industry has been influenced by Jean Shrimpton one way or another. Her influence has endured precisely because she never tried to curate it. Jean helped invent the modern model, not by branding herself, but by refusing to perform beyond the frame. She brought to fashion a quality and elusiveness that had previously been the preserve of cinema, interiority, the sense that something was happening behind the eyes that could not be accessed or explained. That distance, cool, uncooperative, alive, became the defining aesthetic of the decade, and really the rest of the century. In the end, Jean is not contained in the miniskirt or the covers, or even the revolutionary photographs, though all of those remain. Her legacy lies instead in the decision she made at 30, when she walked away from a system that would have happily consumed her for another decade or two before spitting her out. In doing so, she demonstrated a kind of authority that no contract could grant. Jean Shrimpton did not burn out. She did not fade away either. She is very much still here at 83 years old, the eyes just as bright and cool as they ever were. She merely exited that world intact and has lived the rest of her life on her own terms. For a woman who once stood at the centre of the world's gaze, that may be the most radical act of all. Alright, that's all for this one. Jean was quite the 60s icon, and another one who smartly walked away once the decade wound up and darker times arose. A smart lady, if you ask me, and cool as a cucumber. Anyway, I've been Chester. Thanks for listening, have a marvellous one, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.